Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who've experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about cybercrimes. My name is Emilie Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the education coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. With me today, I have Dr. Erica Fissel. Dr. Fissel uses she, her pronouns and is an assistant professor in the Department of Criminal Justice and a member of the Violence Against Women cluster at the University of Central Florida. She is an expert on interpersonal cyber victimization with particular expertise in examining theoretical causes and correlates of victimization, post-victimization behaviors, including reporting and help-seeking behaviors, and the consequences of victimization. So, Dr. Fissel, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to talking about this with you all.
And I also have returning JoEllen Revell. So JoEllen uses she, her pronouns and is the Victim Service Center Program Director who oversees the Advocacy, Therapy, and Forensic Nursing Department. She is a licensed clinical social worker with over 20 years experience in clinical and administrative oversight. So JoEllen, thank you as well for coming back many times onto the podcast.
Thanks, Emilie. Always a pleasure to talk. I look forward to this conversation with Erica.
And as a brief introduction, I'm really excited to have this conversation with both of you today as well, especially with your expertise on this, Erica, because previously on this podcast, we had talked about stalking, both physical stalking and cyber stalking, but today we're actually going to be diving a lot deeper into cybercrime. So we will be talking about some of the different types of cybercrimes, common and harmful misconceptions around this topic, research that is currently being done by Erica and her team, and ways we can help safety plan and prevent cybercrime. So with that, I'd like to just start off, and anyone can jump in. But what constitutes a cybercrime, and what are some types of cybercrimes that come under this umbrella?
That is a great question, and one that might be a little trickier to answer than some might think. So if you ask someone to name a cybercrime, you can probably identify individual behaviors, but coming up with the definition to capture all of cybercrime has been very difficult for practitioners and researchers. And there's also this added issue that there are different terms that have been used interchangeably to capture this idea of cybercrime. So you'll hear a range of terms like computer crimes, computer-assisted crimes, computer-focused crimes, electronic crimes, technologically facilitated crimes, the list goes on. And even when you use the same term, they could be using different definitions. So with all that being said, at the basic level, cybercrimes are typically crimes that are committed through the use of computers, computer networks, or some sort of internet connection. Now, under that umbrella of cybercrimes, there are additional subcategories. And people, again, categorize these differently. But when I talk about it and when I teach it, I typically break it into 4 different categories. The first is what I call techie cybercrimes. So those are going to be things like malware and hacking, require a little more technology knowledge than what the typical person might have. The second is frauds and scams. So that's behaviors like imposter scams or identity theft. The third is interpersonal cybercrimes, which will include things like cyber stalking and intimate partner cyber abuse. And then finally is cybersexual crimes. Now, typically these are forms of interpersonal cybercrimes, but they do have that sexual element, which make them a little bit different. So this will include things like online prostitution or non-consensual pornography. And most of my research does focus on that third group, though, that interpersonal cybercrime.
Thank you so much, Erica. That makes a lot of sense. I like that I appreciate you kind of breaking down these different types of them. And I'm glad that you talked a little bit about the difference between cybersexual, because once you said that, I was like, oh, how is that different than interpersonal? But that makes a lot of sense. And it makes sense that you being part of the violence against women's cluster, that you're more focused on the interpersonal cybercrime. And you mentioned a lot about how, it's kind of difficult with these different names for cybercrimes as far as like technologically facilitated crimes, and also how there's different definitions of it. So with that, when do these kinds of behaviors that we've been talking about become criminal?
Yeah, that's difficult because even if we are using the same definition, laws across states vary. So one state, if we're just taking cyber stalking, for example, one state might just put cyber stalking under their stalking laws and just broaden it to make their stalking law capture cyber stalking behaviors too, while others might not. So they have to create their own cyber stalking specific law. And within that, there's a lot of debate because cyber stalking typically requires the target to experience fear. So then there's the argument of how do you capture that legally, that the individual felt fear, and that can vary from person to person. So something that might make me feel fearful is not something that the criminal justice system might consider fearful. So one thing that I like to give an example with this. So there might be someone cyber stalking someone else, and let's say they repeatedly send a picture of a rose every single day. And that makes the target feel fearful because in previous interactions, there was a rose associated with a threat of violence, for example. So getting that rose sent every single day, which is that repeated pursuit behavior through technology, makes them feel fearful. That would or should be considered illegal and should be considered a crime. But if the criminal justice system or those personnel don't understand why that would make them feel fearful, it doesn't meet that threshold. Now, like I mentioned, there's been a lot of question about this fear standard. There have been some laws that expand it to also include a substantial emotional response. So fear doesn't have to be the only reaction. So now it's if there's any substantial emotional response, but there's still a lot of debate on how to really capture what is needed for cyber stalking. So that's just one example of a cybercrime that has a lot of different definitions across states, and there's a lot of concern about how to capture this. Another issue with cybercrimes is something that's illegal in one jurisdiction might not be illegal in another.
That's a great point. I was going to ask, like, if these crimes are across state lines, what trumps, like, is it the perpetrator's jurisdiction or is it the victim's jurisdiction?
There's a lot of confusion about that. So there have been victims who report it in their jurisdiction and they say, oh, no, report it where the perpetrator is. So then they report it there. And those people say, oh, no, you need to report it where you live. And then the victim gets frustrated because they're going back and forth. No one's really doing anything for them. So they just stop. They don't pursue any sort of criminal justice intervention further.
Is there any information that you have on how that works in Florida? My understanding is that, under the umbrella of stalking is cyber stalking. So that's my understanding of how it works in Florida. I was curious, is fear the standard in Florida or it's substantial emotional response? I'm I wonder about that because I think about people who are getting traditional injunctions, and sometimes I always think of clients or victims, survivors that say, I don't understand why I didn't get this injunction. And then I hear about another person who received an injunction where maybe, in my opinion, the circumstances were less severe. So there is definitely some subjectiveness to these decisions, certainly in terms of the court system. I'm sure that happens also with the investigative function of law enforcement.
Yeah, so last I checked, Florida does have the emotional distress element in it. So, I mean, that does broaden it, but there's still that questioning of how do you prove that you had distress as a result? And this is just obviously one specific type of cybercrime, but if we expand it to looking at like intimate partner cyber abuse, there is no law against that. So typically you might be able to couch it under intimate partner abuse or intimate partner violence, depending on what the behaviors are. But like things like tracking someone via GPS, technically that's not illegal. So it's really difficult to get any sort of criminal justice response for some of these cyber-based behaviors.
I wonder when it comes to a victim standpoint, what would be like the best method to kind of move forward. And so typically speaking, like when someone's been a victim of crime, it is the state that prosecutes the perpetrator, and their intention is to do that. There is not really a lawyer that's assigned to the victim just for the best interest of the victim. And so I would be curious to know if you think like a victim service agency like ourselves could do, what are the things we possibly could do to like better the support that we can provide to a victim when really we have a little bit of our hands are tied legally.
Yeah, so that kind of reminds me of a project that is in very, very early stages. Like we haven't really talked beyond the idea of looking into this, but so a lot of law enforcement or criminal justice agencies, if you have cyber stalking or any sort of cyber-based thing, they try to put it under some other type of crime that increases the likelihood of getting a conviction. Now, that is not something that I think a victim service organization would know, because it's going to be department by department, prosecutor by prosecutor, individual incident by incident. And I don't think that, obviously, that's not something that the victim would know either. So I think that there should be more transparency, though, between those that are making that decision of what charges to put forward, that, hey, we are doing this because we think that you have the best chances of getting justice if we couch it as this type of behavior versus if we couch it as a cybercrime. Because there are some jurisdictions and some courts that are really good about cyber-related crimes. Others, anything related to cybercrime, there are still some judges and lawyers and other people within the criminal justice system that just don't think cybercrime is an important or harmful thing. So you can't couch it as that because they will never get a conviction.
It's so interesting you say that, because before there was actually official human trafficking laws, there was a lot of law enforcement using that racketeering as the charge, because that was like the only way they can pull it forward with a conviction. So it's paralleled in terms of using what you have, using what's legal or illegal at the moment until new penal codes are developed. And these things are happening so quickly in terms of technology and that whole opportunity to be victimized, but the laws take time.
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges with a lot of laws related to cyber crimes that exist are when they were first developed, there was only like email around. So a lot of the laws specifically say through email. or through like landline phones. There's some that say through fax machines too, which I find really funny because who uses a fax machine anymore? But they're not broad enough to capture things like via Snapchat or TikTok or Twitter or online video games or the smart home systems. So that's one of the biggest challenges with these laws. Well, one of many challenges with these laws is they're not broad enough.
Interesting. I'm curious about something. And once again, I'm sorry if I'm taking the conversation in a different direction, but I wonder if there is like any special interest as it relates to the platform, like Facebook as a platform, TikTok, Snapchat, because it's a private entity and there's FCC rules and there's a lot of things. So sounds and seems like there's a lot of federal decisions that need to be made in order for state laws to be implemented or changed or modified. This is a big topic we're touching on.
Yeah, and I actually have some data that we collected recently that looked at cyber harassment on what we named the 4 main social media platforms. And we looked at people's responses to their cyber victimization. So did they report it to law enforcement and did they report it to social media platforms? And what was their level of satisfaction? And our argument is going to be that, you know, most people report to social media rather than law enforcement. So we think that there needs to be a lot stronger of a connection or a working relationship between social media platforms and law enforcement. Now, the issue with that obviously is data privacy. You sign up for these social media platforms thinking that your information is not going anywhere. There's a lot of issues, obviously, with warrants to get access to accounts and stuff. So it's a very tricky thing going on.
Extremely complex, complicated. And I think the future we'll just kind of see how it pans out. But, you know, sometimes you talk about something and it seems kind of, oh, everything makes sense. And then as you really digest it, and I'm sure as a researcher, this must fascinate you. I actually did have a question in terms of what got you into this field of interest, because I would really like to know, personally speaking.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of just stumbled upon it. I thought it was really interesting so I obviously am really interested in human behavior, and I kind of started from the perpetrator side. I was really interested in why some people engaged in law-abiding behaviors while some didn't. And then I thought that cyber element was really interesting because you have that disguise. You can disguise yourself, you can be anonymous. So who are these people who, if they're anonymous, they'll engage in these behaviors? I thought that was really interesting. But as I progressed through my criminal justice PhD, I thought more about where I can actually make a difference in society. And for me, like, unfortunately, there's always going to be people who engage in perpetration. There's always going to be those people who exist. And so what can we do then to reduce crime? Well, what if we focused on the victims? How do we protect people from being victimized in the first place? How do we improve their experiences after experiencing these victimizations? So it was really just genuine curiosity. And that's how I got here.
Thank you for sharing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that you're right, JoEllen, and this is definitely like a rabbit hole, kind of like the more that you go down, the more complicated you start to see that it is. Part of what you said, Erica, really resonated with me, which is this concept of how do you prove that you were emotionally distressed? How do you prove that you are fearful? What does that mean to you? And it kind of parallels to maybe sex crimes too, in the sense like, how do you, he said, she said, they said kind of situation. I think that proving that you have gone through a victimization can be really difficult on a survivor, and it can be really emotionally draining.
Yeah, and so for cyber stalking, requiring that fear or emotional distress, it's pretty much the only crime that exists that you have to prove that you had some sort of reaction to, right? Like someone could break into your house and steal all of your things and you are a victim, whether you care or not. So it's putting that burden back on the victim to prove it. But like, why? What is the point of doing that?
It's so fascinating. Just to kind of, I've heard that same analogy when I talk to like the state attorney's office staff regarding sex crimes, where, you know, having sex is not a crime, but in certain occurrences, there is criminal behavior. And, you know, you kind of airing out your personal laundry or your beliefs or your past history, and there's a lot to it. It's fascinating to think about, did this cyber act, cause me any distress or significant distress? Like, what does that actually mean? And isn't it a victim's right to self-determine, you know, whether it's nothing or it's the worst scenario I've ever dealt with? That's what people like when we encounter victims, and we sometimes see people that are, you know, very unaffected because whatever their past is in terms of if this has happened before, their stage of development, their age, things of that sort. And others, where it's very atypical, the reaction is extreme in terms of whether it's like stuck in the anger, you know, or stuck in the emotion. It's a little bit, to some of the advocates that might see people acutely, it might come across as like, well, this is an extreme reaction, not knowing exactly where it's coming from based on the circumstances that we know. So it's a reactionary thing that we would have to talk about. And why would that even matter? And should that even matter? Should we be like catastrophizing everything? Or should we just be like, super aloof, no big deal? It's fascinating.
Yeah. And so you bring up a really good point, because some states, while they might have the fear standard that the target of the repeated pursuit behavior experience fear, other states have that a reasonable person would feel fearful. So then it's, okay, if you have a victim A and they are terrified, but whoever this entity is who decides what a reasonable person would feel, they would say a reasonable person would not feel fearful. So then you're saying that the victim's unreasonable because they had an emotional reaction to their experience. That's super problematic.
Wow, it is.
And that kind of brings me to like this other portion of this, which is the myths surrounding it and the misconceptions. I know you kind of mentioned that there's this idea that cybercrimes are not harmful. And I think that kind of, as we go through this conversation, how would you address that if someone shared that with you?
Yeah, so a lot of people, I get this all the time when like a stranger talks to me on the plane and they're like, what do you do? And it's always horrible to engage in conversations with people on planes. But so you tell them, you know, I research cyber victimization, and they're like, I don't know why people make such a big deal out of it. You can just turn off your computer or block the person and it'll be fine. Just stay offline. And I mean, obviously there are several things wrong with that. But first, it's 2021. What are you going to be doing in life that does not require you to be connected to some sort of technology at some point in your life, right? That you don't need to be on social media to experience cyber victimization. I think that's one of the biggest misperceptions, that people just think that cyber crimes occur through social media, and that's not the only place. You have text messages are considered cyber crimes because it's through that kind of computer network, internet network, whatever it is. So I also like to counter those types of comments with, well, people can create multiple accounts. You can hide your identity online. It's not that hard. And another common tactic is if you shut down all of your accounts because you're a victim or you stay off them, they'll move on to people that you're close with. So they'll reach out to your family members. They'll reach out to your friends to try to keep tabs on you or get some sort of communication with you that way. So it's not like you can just be done with it if you limit your online presence. We also know things like, you know, friends tag you or post pictures of you online. So if you go out to the bars with friends, they post on Instagram. If your perpetrator is following them, they know where you are. So it doesn't even matter necessarily what your own online behaviors are. It's everyone around you too that could be putting you, quote unquote, at risk for that person. And I've done some research on the harms of cyber stalking. So in my research, 3 out of 4 victims of cybercrime or cyber stalking, experience some sort of consequence as a result, whether it was health consequences, social consequences, work consequences, or school consequences. 3 out of 4 experience some sort of harm as a result. And what's really problematic with that is people aren't reporting. So they're experiencing these harms and then they're not reporting. They're not engaging in help-seeking behaviors. So these people are suffering on their own.
There's a lot of shame behind that, I'm thinking. Embarrassment, shame, opinions of others, which really blends into the whole realm of sex crimes as well, similar kind of responses and reactions. And then, so go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, you're absolutely right. These misperceptions that like only gullible or stupid or older individuals fall victim to cybercrime, well, then you don't want to share that with people if you know that's what their belief is. So it's that victim blaming issue. It's these misperceptions and stereotypes.
And also kind of going off of that, the added burden of, am I reacting big enough for this to be considered a crime? I think that self-doubt and can also factor into this. I know another misconception is that perpetrators are typically strangers. So what have you found in your research in regards to that?
Yeah, so if we're thinking of interpersonal cybercrime specifically, they're depending on the individual type, sometimes it is most likely to be a stranger, but a lot of times it's not. A lot of times you are cyberstalked, for example, by someone known to you, typically a former or current intimate partner. So that's really problematic because a lot of people also say like, keep your online privacy setting or keep your online accounts set to private and don't add people you don't know to social media. And quite frankly, those are probably good ideas to protect yourself from being targeted by strangers. But when it's someone known to you, that doesn't help, right? It doesn't matter if you have private online settings when it's the person you're living with tracking you via GPS. Like those self-protective behaviors are not actually going to protect you in those types of cases.
Yeah, I remember I'm going to age myself, but back in the day, there was a movie like Single White Female, and it was like this stalkerish thing because they were roommates. And like at the time, that was like pretty the furthest you can go because we didn't have these cell phones and all this accessibility. But as that develops, for all the good, there's a lot of bad.
Yeah, one of my students last semester, I think it was, said something that just kind of blew my mind, which is that when technology was developed and these social media platforms were being developed, it was all about thinking how to improve life and how do we connect people virtually and things like that. No one had in their mind that people are going to be using this for bad. And now it's like we have to backtrack. Now that we see what people are actually doing with this type of technology, we have to go in reverse, like 20 years back to the beginning of where like the internet was becoming popular and stuff to figure out, well, what now can we do? Because we didn't think about this on the front end and how to keep people safe.
Yeah, it's like we've had homes, there's always been homes, but it's not like we've had alarm systems on homes and camera systems on homes for all these years. So it could take us, it might not even be in our lifetime until some of these things are really remedied, if ever fully remedied, because by that time, we might be able to just go snap our finger and make a phone call without a device. Who knows? I hate to say it like that, but the progression of technology is advancing quite quickly.
Yeah, and I think it's just another tool that can, just like any tool that people can be used for good, and then can also be used for crimes. Why is it important, all these myths that we were talking about, how some people think that it only happens to stupid or gullible people, or that, for example, the perpetrators aren't, they're strangers, or it's not harmful. Why is it important that we address these myths?
One of my overarching goals and like my career goals is to really push back against these misperceptions that people hold about victimization, because there are these real behavioral implications as a result. And we've kind of touched on some of these, but one of the first things that comes to mind is the idea of victim blaming. If people don't understand that literally anyone could experience a cyber victimization, it has nothing to do with your intelligence or your age or anything like that, then once people realize that, then we might be able to support victims more. And likening that to sex-related assaults, sexually based victimizations, right? They're very similar. There's also issues with reporting. So if people don't think that they're going to be believed, or there's not laws against these types of things, people aren't going to report, people aren't going to get criminal justice assistance, there won't be justice, and they also won't engage in help-seeking behaviors to improve their life situation, right? So people have depression as a result, or anxiety as a result of their cyber victimizations, but if they're not seeking help for that, they're living in this constant state of fear, which no one should have to experience. And then one of the biggest things is that people just aren't identifying the things that they experience as abuse or crime. They don't know that it's not okay that they've experienced these things. And even worse, potentially, is that people who are engaging in these types of behaviors don't know it's problematic to do so. So there's so many things that if we actually educate, if we push back against these myths, we can improve on so many things.
I think this speaks a lot to some of the education that Emilie does as our education coordinator, because really, and we talk about this all the time, people don't traditionally learn about healthy relationships, asking for consent, understanding what feels okay and what doesn't feel okay in terms of, I'm uncomfortable with this. Those things become learned sometimes well into adulthood, past many multiple partners, if they ever become learned. And it really causes a lot of damage to individuals. We see a lot of our clients really needing like DBT informed skills groups, just to kind of be able to identify feelings about relationships and learn and journal and kind of do homework about that. And we haven't even mastered as a society general interpersonal relationships. Now we're throwing in this whole veil or layer or complex fog, if you will, related to technology and cyber relationships. And I would wonder, and I don't know if there's enough time yet to kind of see the lasting impacts of cyber stalking and cyber victimization, because it sounds like, and I could be wrong, they may be in line with or maybe more intense as it relates to kind of like a sex crime or domestic violence or human trafficking in some way.
Yeah, so there hasn't been much, if any, longitudinal research on cyber victimization. Hopefully that's changing. I'm submitting a grant related to that, so fingers crossed for me. But the thing is, with cyber victimization, generally, regardless of what type it is it can follow you everywhere. You always have your phone in your pocket. So it's not like bullying, which is obviously problematic, but typically it remained in the school, right? You went home, you were able to escape from it. But with cyber-based victimizations, you have no safe space. It is literally following you everywhere. So in my opinion, and I might be biased, but I think the long-term impacts of cyber-based crimes are going to be more significant than those of traditional offline crimes, because there might not actually be an end to it.
Yeah, it's like this stuck feeling. It's always ever presently there. And maybe even after time has passed, someone even addresses it or brings it up, because what's on the internet often stays on the internet. And so who knows? It's fascinating. I support your grant, and I hope there's a lot to be learned about it, because there's certainly more questions, as we're seeing in this conversation, than there are answers. As a mom of a teenager and an 11-year-old, these things worry me. Like, you want technology to advance kind of their capacity to fit in and such, but then it's just such a mystery. There's so many sites, there's so many layers of things, and there's so many kind of terms or acronyms of things that I'm like, I don't even know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Generationally, I guess I have to learn that.
Yeah, so we talk about that a lot about, who's responsible for teaching people how to be safe online. And the initial reaction is to say it's parents. And, I think that's one source, potential source. But if you're thinking about people who might have kids that are in like their teens, whenever they get access to phones, they might not have grown up with technology or be as technologically savvy as younger generations. So they might say things like, don't talk to strange men in chat rooms. Cool. Chat rooms are like not a thing anymore, right? Like no one goes onto a chat room. You don't have AOL Instant Messenger anymore. And then there's the issue of things that have the disappearing like feature. So Instagram, you can have things posted for only 24 hours. Snapchat, 10 seconds. TikTok, I haven't even stepped into that realm. So I don't know what TikTok's all about, but that becomes even more problematic too, because then there's not evidence, right? So people think that with cybercrime, it's so easy to get convictions because there's this trail, there's always digital evidence, but that's not always the case. And also linking it to that person's IP address or making sure that it's actually that person, proving that it's that person that was behind the computer. It's just so complicated all around. It's just complicated.
I wonder how much it costs to kind of really truly prosecute a cybercrime, because the cost for the experts in terms of technology is probably steep. And it's like, well, maybe we could kind of use that funding for, instead of just being heavy on prosecution costs, maybe it could be more on preventive measures. Who knows? I mean, we talk about that all the time in terms of prevention would help a bit more, but it hasn't always been funded the way that it needs to.
Right.
And I think that speaking of prevention, and before I get to these parts, I always bring this up in my presentations too, kind of like risk reduction. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we could safety plan against and help protect against cyber crimes. But essentially, I always like to start off by, how do we also do prevention in a sense that isn't putting all of the burden once again on the victim, right? I think that it's important that we all do what we would like to do to make ourselves feel safe. So as we go into this conversation, I always like to point out, like, whatever happens, it's not your fault. You can do any of these safety plan things or none of them, any of these risk reduction or none of them. And what happened is still the perpetrator's fault. But as we go through these, I just wanted to start that off. But JoEllen, how can safety planning actually help protect against cybercrimes? And then I'd like to hear from you too, Erica. I'm sure that you've done a lot of research in this as well.
I mean, I think I'm going to speak in general when it comes to a safety plan. I think there's this idea that I can take emotional control and I can take physical control of something. It's empowering to have that opportunity, whether it's developing it on your own or having a victim advocate do it with you, to kind of say, like, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and it kind of builds a level of confidence that there are ways, there are options. It's like muscle memory, right? So when you repeat an action or you're aware of what you're going to do, like a fire drill, you know how you're going to exit the building. Like that should be how a safety plan is considered. Okay, so let's role play this. Let's go over these scenarios. And every scenario is different, but it will be specific to that individual. And so sometimes it may be, okay, so at night you're going to put your phone on silent. You're going to have an alarm at these 3 intervals. You're going to reach your mother at this point as a check-in. And then in the morning, you're going to emotionally release by journaling, taking a hot bath, whatever that looks like. There are layers and layers of ways to safety plan. There are great resources online, but it would my most important advice is being very, very specific to that individual and what they have the capacity to do. And a plan for a 70-year-old male versus a 19-year-old female, they both might have experienced cyber stalking. They're going to have a very different safety plan depending on their friend zone, what they're comfortable with, what skills they've already used that's worked in the past, all those kind of contributing factors.
Yeah, and I think it also has to do with the type of cybercrime that they're experiencing. So it's a little different talking about what you could do to prevent or safety plan related to a cybercrime that you're experiencing from someone that you know versus someone that's a stranger. So a stranger that is like truly a stranger, like someone that's in a completely different area, you've never met them, you have no ties to them, they're a little easier to cut off potentially than those who are, like I said earlier, potentially someone that you're living with. So if you're trying to get yourself out of an abusive relationship that has intimate partner cyber abuse related to it, well, you're going to want to make sure that you're not leaving traces on your computer of your plan to leave, right? So there are things like burner phones and different flash drives that you can plug into your computer that don't leave a trace on your computer. Like there's no digital evidence that was plugged in there. So that's a little different than, but someone trying to get a stranger to stop interacting with them. There's things like you could take, if it's through social media, you could take social media off your mobile device and only access it through computers. So there are things I think to manage potentially, but also when you're talking to the criminal justice system about like what to do if you're experiencing these things, their typical reaction or response is document everything. So if there is some, oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say absolutely. Like all layers of it is keeping a record and keeping track. And I think that's good and documented is great. It also can make it a little too real for someone as well. The idea of writing a witness statement or a victim statement, it's very similar that, oh my God, this reality that I got to put on paper. So keep that in mind. And also know that we've always had for individuals when it comes to safety planning, some people, they very much want to eliminate, deactivate, get rid of platforms. And if that is their choice, that's their choice. You may lose some of that great documentation and evidence by that choice. But people may decide they're okay with that emotionally, they want to let go. And it has to be the individual's choice, honestly.
Yeah, I think you're spot on that it's very, very individualized, which makes it difficult to have this type of conversation, to give tips and stuff. But I really do think it's based on everybody's unique experiences.
Definitely. And I'd love to learn more too, Erica, about more of your research. What exactly are you researching? What have you found? Is there anything that you can share? And then what do you hope that people can learn from these studies?
Yeah, so I have a lot of research going on right now, but I'm going to just really talk about two that have kind of come up a little bit throughout this conversation. So the first one is a project that we're calling the Cybercrime Myth Acceptance Project. And I'm working on this with Dr. Jin Lee, who is at George Mason University. And the goal of this project is to understand basically those beliefs and misperceptions individuals have related to cybercrime. So we both, because we're both in cybercrime research, have heard anecdotally what people think, but we wanted a more systematic way of looking at what do people actually think about cybercrimes. And then based on our data that we're collecting, we want to develop a scale, which is very similar to the rate myth acceptance scale. So this scale will be able to measure the extent to which people believe these different misperceptions. And our goal is then to use this scale to see how does belief in these cybercrime myths impact your likelihood of engaging in perpetration, your experiences with victimization, your experiences with reporting after experience of victimization, how it impacts criminal justice personnel processing cases throughout the criminal justice system, et cetera, et cetera. And then also interested in looking at what causes people to have these myths and misperceptions about cybercrimes. And then the ultimate goal is creating educational and training programs that really push back, challenge these problematic beliefs, and change how people are thinking about cybercrimes. So that's project one. I don't know if anyone wants to respond to that before I move on to the other.
I just wanted to say, I love that your research is like, so basically I'm going to save the world.
That's the goal.
I love it. No, I love that's fantastic. And I don't know if you have anything you want to add to it, JoEllen.
No, I think it's having scales are very important. I think when we aggregate and look at things over time, we can really tell the impact on individuals at large. So I think it's fascinating, and I'd love to hear how it goes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I love that there is a commonality between the rape myth acceptance scale and the cybercrime acceptance scale. I think that that's really fascinating, and it makes sense because all of these kinds of like power and control and things like that are related. So it makes sense that these misconceptions are also correlated. But yeah, I'd love to hear about your other research as well.
Yeah, and the other main one that I've been working on is related to intimate partner cyber abuse. And I'm working on this with Dr. Leah Butler and Dr. Bonnie Fisher. But one piece specifically that we are looking at currently, we're finishing up the manuscript on, is about the normalization of intimate partner cyber abuse behaviors. And this came out of when we were first developing this project, we were trying to create a measure of intimate partner cyber abuse because there's just not a lot of research on it. We don't know really anything about the prevalence and what individual behaviors look like within that. So we did a pilot test of our survey with 50 respondents just to see how the responses looked if we needed to make changes to the survey. And we found that 100% of respondents experienced intimate partner cyber abuse within the previous 6 months. So we were like, either our measure is wrong or this is way more problematic than we thought it was. So then when we looked deeper into some of the open-ended responses, is people explained that there are situations or conditions in which these types of behaviors are okay. So tracking via GPS could be a safety measure in some relationships. Tracking someone's finances online could be an agreed upon thing because one of the partners is really bad at finances. So the other partner takes responsibility for that. And they're totally happy with that. It's part of their healthy relationship. Other relationships, though, these two behaviors could be really about power and control and really abusive type relationships. So we are really interested in looking at, with this specific paper, are some of these behaviors just things that, young adults grew up thinking that this is okay to do, like tracking someone's location via Snapchat? That's just a normal thing to do. People do that. It's okay to do that. It's not harmful to do that. So that's what that project's all about, is looking at, is our society kind of desensitized to cyber-based behaviors that might actually be abusive?
It's super interesting. Another project I want to hear more about, definitely as it progresses. When you were speaking about kind of like a person being okay with some things and not others, my mind goes back to those times that we have victims where, they could have been in a relationship, and a consensual, intimate relationship with someone. And for example, they were okay with anal sex at that moment. But a month later, when they're engaging with them, they were not, and they did not consent to that. But it was previously okay. And therefore, if it happens again and it's not consented to, it's not okay. And so there is a blurriness in some ways in terms of this event is okay. And it's about communication ultimately at the end of the day and making decisions.
Yeah, and that's what one thing that gets really complicated with cyber-based behaviors is figuring out where one instance or incident ends and the other begins. So like was I okay with you tracking my GPS location between the hours of 9 and 12 because I was driving somewhere, but you're tracking me from 2 to 4 and I am not okay with that? Is that all one incident because it's within the same day, or is it two separate incidences? Like, that becomes tricky.
Wow, that's complicated.
Point, because there's this thing where I use this app called like Find My Friends or something like that on my Apple device, and I share my location with family members and they share it with me. And I do know that there's certain family members that have expressed to me that they feel uncomfortable when other family members like check on them and say like, oh, I see that you left the store, like things like that. And so I think that it is going back to these boundaries and how there is a myth that, in my opinion, like a physical boundary and a technological boundary there's still boundaries. And so there's this myth like, oh, it's okay, even though my location, it might be shared all the time. It doesn't mean that I'm comfortable with you like checking up on me all the time, right? And so just kind of going back to advocating for, yourself and knowing what you are comfortable with, because I think part of it is also that introspective work. And so as technology progresses and knowing that like it's okay to not feel comfortable with this and to express that to someone, and that these do have real lasting effects. You did see that 3 out of 4 victims of cyber crimes did have these effects, right?
Just to bounce off that a little more, so we talk about consent and you give consent in this instance, not this instance, but then you also have to take it back another step and see how was that consent or permission obtained. So did you give permission for someone to track you via GPS because you were coerced or threatened to give it? That's very different than someone's like, yeah, I don't care, track my GPS location. So that's another added layer that makes this very, very difficult.
Definitely. I think that, through your research, what do you want the public to know? What are kind of some goals as far as like, you find out this information, what do you want people to learn from it?
I mean, I think really as a victimologist, I just want people to support victims more and to believe when people come forward that they're experiencing something. Believe them. They experience something, whether or not you've never experienced it or can't imagine experiencing it or don't even think it's harmful. That's not for you to decide. So I just want society generally to understand these types of crimes, understand that there are harms. And then I do want to see some real changes within the criminal justice system in terms of holding perpetrators responsible for cyber-based crimes and giving more resources to those who are experiencing it.
Definitely. And that kind of leads me to a couple of my last questions here, which is what can someone do if they are experiencing cyber abuse? What are some like next steps? I know we talked about like, you could document everything and things like that, but anything else you would want to uplift as far as what people can do after they've experienced this victimization?
I'll start in terms of getting support and maybe looking where, obviously Victim Service Center, we're here in Central Florida, and there may be like agencies or similar agencies in other parts of the state or country. But if there's not, you can always consult with the state attorney's office that typically has victim advocates. Law enforcement, many of them do have victim advocates. Office of the Attorney General also has individuals that work in an advocacy role. So if you're seeking guidance from a professional, that's super helpful at times. And I say this not because I'm a program director at a victim service agency, but the idea and the concept that this is a professional whose interest is specifically for your best interest. And there is no bias, ties, or association to whomever the perpetrator may be, if it's a family friend, if it's a relative, if it's a business associate. So sometimes that gets really tricky and blurry. We see that with sexual assault crimes. It seems very similar with these crimes. The belief, the start by believing, the believing unconditionally doesn't always happen when there's already a pre-existing relationship or connection. So that's why I would advocate for finding a professional resource that can guide you through and maybe link you up with even more resources.
Yeah, another great place to reach out is the Cybercrime Support Network. I work with this nonprofit, and they have a wonderful resource page on their website that you can look at, like individual type of cybercrime that you're experiencing. It'll give you resources in your state, which is really useful. They help both small businesses and individuals, and for a variety of types of cybercrime. So the techie ones, the interpersonal ones, they got you covered. But I think my one maybe piece of advice beyond what we've already talked about is just don't do it alone. Just find somebody that does support you, whether it is a professional like JoEllen was saying, or a friend or a family member, because these are real things. These are emotionally draining things. Just find a support system.
And I know that we were talking a lot about like the criminal justice system and reporting and things like that. I wanted to just kind of throw this question out there. How can someone maybe start the healing process if the criminal justice system doesn't work out or things like that? Or maybe that isn't the route that they want to take?
Like I always say, going down the criminal justice avenue is not always the path to healing for individuals. Closure looks different for every person, and healing is going to look different for every individual. So the fact of the matter is a case could get picked up, it could be heavily prosecuted, the person could be sentenced. That doesn't necessarily take away any of the emotional damage that was caused by that crime. So I think there has to be a parallel process of kind of emotional healing, and then determining whether it's civil, criminal, that path is going to be remedied. And some people need time to kind of be like emotionally stable before they even engage in that. And then you get into all statute of limitations on crimes and such, which is a way separate podcast. But the point is that it doesn't always happen in a snap of a finger in time, and it take forever. And you may continuously need a booster of therapy or counseling throughout your lifetime because the emotions that may come up related to the crime.
Yeah, and I think, so some cyber crimes that you experience, it's not even like worth it to go down the criminal justice route. So as a personal example, my credit card information just got stolen and I had to cancel my card and whatever, but my credit card company gave me all my money back. So I was like, cool, why do I need to report this? Like I'm good, which is probably the wrong mindset to have. I probably should report it, but the criminal justice process would not give me anything beyond what my credit card did. So also thinking about the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, IC3, they don't engage in the criminal justice process. Typically, when people report to them, they work with banks to make sure you get your money back when it's something like fraud or identity theft. They work to make sure you get your money back. And most of the time at the end of the day, that's it. And that's a lot of times all that victims want back. You took my money, give me my money back. I got it. I'm good to go. But that's a little different than some of these interpersonal forms of cybercrime. So again, it kind of depends on what cybercrime you're experiencing to what is the best path. But again, it's also kind of unique to what you're experiencing and what your goal or your outcome that you want out of the experience.
I also think it could set up, if it's someone that you knew or didn't know and they kind of took money from you or something like that, or if it was an anticipated relationship that actually the person was, it was a scam or a fraud, and that loss of that hope of a relationship, those little nuggets of life can really impact someone in the moment. And then in a future relationship, if they're engaged with someone online and that person's legit, they might have a fear like, I'm going to get screwed over again. And I can't trust people. So it's going to impact us in some way, in some form.
Definitely. And I know, just as like a final question, what can we do as a society to help prevent cyber abuse? I know that we talked a lot about believing survivors. So maybe we could start off as why is it important to believe survivors, and any other things that we can do for those listening at home that we can do to help prevent this.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that isn't thought about or talked about in the same way as traditional offline forms of crime is bystander intervention. If you're seeing problematic things happening on Twitter, for example, I mean, not that you should like throw yourself in and start commenting back, but report it somehow or reach out to the victim specifically and say, do you need help? Do you need support? What can I do to help you? I think bystander intervention in the online realm just doesn't happen. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we can change.
Oh, that's a great idea. I love everything you just said. It's so important. And it's true. Like there are features on most platforms that allow individuals to report. It's making that decision to do it and making it, with good intention, and then how do we, if somebody's blocked or they're reported, it's not like, Snapchat has a counselor to call and say, you've been, somebody reported you were harassed. What do we do from here? I mean, that would be a really cool job to have. Maybe we create a new profession. You're a cyber counselor for those who have been harassed online. I don't know what that looks like, but I will say many people are hiding behind facades about who they are, with really, really bad intentions. And so just be always careful about that. But I love your idea. I think that's a great idea. Bystander intervention. We need to voice that more.
Yeah. And so I would love to see social media platforms or other online platforms have more responsibility for what's going on their platforms. I also know realistically, that's going to be super difficult. Like, how do you go through all of the reports of something? If someone flags someone's comment, I know it's going to be difficult. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it though. Difficult thing. There's a lot of things in the world that are difficult. So I think changing the way that social media platforms probably respond to those types of reports is important. Though I do think that, I think it's Instagram just recently made this new policy that if your account gets deleted, or like suspended or whatever it is, you cannot create another account. Now, I don't know how they figure that out. I don't know if it's based on like your IP or your email or your phone. I haven't looked into it, but I do think that's an interesting and good first step. I know that there are some people who argue that you should have to verify your identity before creating an account, like show your driver's license or your state issued or country, whatever, passport to prove that you are who you say you are. Some people aren't very happy about that because they have the fake accounts. They have accounts where they want to be anonymous for either good or bad reasons. Like some people do have anonymous, like Twitter accounts. There's one related to it's like funny quotes about academia that someone would never post on with their identity, but this person does because they're anonymous. You wouldn't be able to have those. So it's just balancing those two things, like harm reduction while not taking away from people's rights, I guess. And then I guess we haven't talked about this at all, but another issue with cybercrime related things are like First Amendment. Like you can say a lot of things, and when does it become problematic? So that's just adding something in here at the end that is another added element that has to come out of this.
Yeah, I think you bring up so many great points. And I think that once again, it's just highlighting how complicated it is and how difficult it would be for just one entity to tackle it. And I think that as a bystander, I would also invite to say that just like you can, if you're going through the justice system, as a victim, you can in parallel also be getting emotional support. You can do parallel bystander intervention. There isn't just one way to jump in. So of course you can flag the comment, you can report it to Twitter, what have you. You can also turn around and check in on the victim, and do it that way as well. You can also share it on some other page to get more like feedback or other people to join in and be like, hey, this is happening. Can you also flag it or whatever? You can do parallel bystander intervention too.
Yeah, the tricky thing that just pops into my head is that sometimes when people are trying to intervene, they go and engage in cybercrime themselves. So it's like, I'm going to intervene because you are attacking this person, and now I'm going to attack you and bully you. Well, that's not the right way to intervene, obviously. But that's a very typical response from just anecdotally what I've seen because of the how cyberspace is.
Yeah, the vigilante kind of experience where, you know, in live real life, like those would be like big news stories. Like there was this vigilante. There's vigilantes everywhere on the internet. People really personally believe that they are doing justice. They are getting the word out. They're doing things. But you're exactly right. They could be crossing a line, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up because there are those concepts of, I believe they're called like witch hunts and things like that. And so I suppose as an active bystander, you can jump in and share resources with the victim and say, hey, you're not alone. I believe you, things like that. And also maybe just report to like Twitter, and then maybe that's kind of like the best approach.
Yeah, I mean, you could definitely also say things like, this is not okay. You shouldn't be talking to people like that. But if you're like, oh, you're ugly, your mom, blah, 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 like all those horrible things, then you're just as bad as the person that you're trying to stop. So, I mean, I don't want listeners to think, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't say anything. You can, just don't be a horrible person yourself in response.
Yeah, maybe kind of. Absolutely. There's different ways to jump in, right? Before we sign off, and I know we kind of opened like a lot of last minute can of worms. Is there anything else that you'd like to bring up that we may not have covered?
No, I really just wanted to extend a thank you for such an informative conversation, Erica. It's super. I really learned a lot, and I really
I'm
think
glad.
I would love to continue to engage in more conversations. And who knows, maybe we expand on this since we just kind of hit the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would love, Emilie, if you ever want to do any like educational stuff about cyber safety or whatever, hit me up.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much. I learned a lot too. And I just want to thank the listener for listening to the Victim Service Center. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone. And thank you so much, JoEllen and Erica, for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.